All right, welcome to Disability Rights University's session on Medicaid and EPSDT. If you don't know what that is, you will find out shortly. My name is Maggie Knowles and I will be the host today. Just a few housekeeping things for you. Thank you for coming. This session is being recorded and it will be put on YouTube after the event in a week or so. Also, please note that all participants have been muted. We will take questions at the end of the session. If you have a question, feel free to type it into the chat box or raise your hand. And we will go ahead and get started and use everybody's time wisely. If I can go ahead and have the next slide. Before we get started, I just want to point out our upcoming sessions. In September, we'll be talking about service animals. In October, assistive technology. And in November, we'll be having our second guardianship session. If you missed the first one, it is available on YouTube for you. And before we get started, we're just going to have a quick poll. This is just to allow our funders to know who is coming to our sessions. If you don't mind telling us who you are, and that will also help our speakers know who they were speaking to today. All right, I think that is about it. We're about 2/3 people from the professional community and about 1/3 family members, friends, or caregivers. Excellent. Let me go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. We have Anna Maria Connor and Rebecca Spanigal. These are two of our attorneys here from Disability Rights South Carolina, and I will let them take it.
So let's get to the next slide. First of all, I'm Anna Maria Connor, and I'm happy to be here with you today. We are going to cover some really big topics, Medicaid, waivers, and EPSDT, and try to explain in an hour what those things are and give you some tools to navigate those systems. Hopefully you know about DRSC. We are the P&A for the state. We provide free services, including free information referral, sometimes representation, and trainings like today. So let's go to next slides. Next slide. The basics of Medicaid. This is why we're here today. First of all, Medicaid is an insurance plan for certain groups of people in our country. It provides health coverage to children, pregnant women, parents, seniors, low-income adults, and individuals with disabilities. The thing to remember is that this is a contract between each state and the federal Medicaid agency or the federal government. So each plan or insurance policy, if you want to call it that, is unique to that state. And there is always a single state agency that is designated as the Medicaid agency for the state. And as we like to say here, the buck stops at that Medicaid agency in terms of making sure that the Medicaid services and the program is conducted according to the law and fairly and properly and transparently to the individuals who are receiving services from that agency and to the individuals who support that agency through state dollars, tax income, and things like that. And for South Carolina, our agency is Department of Health and Human Services. Next slide. All right. Another important thing to think about in terms of Medicaid is that it is what we call the payer of last resort. So if you are a Medicaid individual and you have private insurance or you have Medicare or both, those two insurance policies pay first for whatever services you are eligible for and that you need and that you receive. And then Medicaid pays last. If you are somebody who is also on a Medicaid waiver, a special program that we're going to explain later, then Medicaid would pay as the third payment in this stream, and then the fourth area of payment would be Medicaid waivers or the waiver that you are on. Next slide. All right, so in Medicaid, you have what is called a state plan. The state plan is actually just the insurance policy that the state has created with the cooperation and agreement of the federal government. Every state plan is developed by that state. There are a list of mandatory services that have to be provided by every state who has a Medicaid plan or a Medicaid program. And there's a list of optional services. And that, again, is what makes each state's Medicaid service or program unique, is the state gets to choose from those optional programs or services what they want to put into their state plan or their state insurance policy. So it's always important to know that the first document you look at when you're determining what you might want to ask for once you become a Medicaid beneficiary is what services are in the state plan. What does my state plan have that I might need? So next slide. The other important thing to remember about Medicaid is that you have to show medical necessity to qualify for services. So you cannot just say, I would like to have nursing services if you don't have a medical necessity for nursing services. States are allowed to limit the number of services based upon a judgment about the person's medical condition and whether or not there is a true medical necessity. Medical necessity is not specifically defined by federal law, but it is usually established and justified by the recommendations of your medical professionals. So in other words, you go to the doctor, you get not only the diagnosis of your condition, but you also get a recommendation as to what kind of treatment you need. And part of what they should be doing for you is how much of that service do they think you need? If it's a nursing service, for instance, are your physical nursing needs so high that you need at least 8 hours a day? And is it skilled nursing, or do you need assistance that is more in the line of a personal aid? Somebody who might help you dress, but doesn't have to give you a shot, for instance. So then is it appropriate that you receive nursing services, and how many hours or units of nursing services would you need? Or do you need personal assistance? And again, how many hours or units of personal assistance would you need? And there are also other ways that the state can try to control the access to services, such as asking for prior authorization before you go and agree to buy a new wheelchair or another high dollar item. Sometimes if you get a recommendation from a doctor for a new drug, then before that is approved by Medicaid, you might need to submit a specific request for prior authorization to get that new wheelchair, or to go on to a new, more costly, or sometimes an experimental drug or treatment before you can actually go and obtain that from your medical provider. Next slide. So now we're going to move into what Medicaid waivers are, and I'm going to ask Rebecca to begin this topic.
Thanks, Anna Maria. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rebecca Spanigal, and I'm going to talk a bit about Medicaid home and community-based services waivers. So you may ask when you see this term, just why is this called a waiver? What does that mean? And all it really means is that from a legal perspective, the Medicaid agency is seeking to ask the federal government to waive one of the requirements so that they can serve a particular population or offer a particular set of services. So we often deal with services that are designed, or waivers that are designed to offer additional or enhanced services for specific types of disabilities. Next slide, please. So home and community-based service waivers are extremely important for people with disabilities because they offer home and community-based services to people that would otherwise have to go into an institutional setting. These are services that an individual may need because, again, absent those community services, they would have to go into an institution. So it's incredibly important that they meet that level of care and are able to access those services. So in South Carolina, we have several different home and community-based services waivers. Several of them are administered by the Department of Disabilities and Special Needs. So for example, the Intellectual Disability and Related Disabilities waiver, the Community Supports waiver, and the Head and Spinal Cord Injury waivers are all designed to provide services to those specific disability populations. In addition, the Department of Health and Human Services offers the Community Choices waiver, which is designed to help people with physical disabilities and who may be aged. Next slide, please.
Rebecca, before we go on, It's important to note that even though DDSN oversees the daily operations of the waivers, for instance, the individual with developmental disabilities and related disabilities waiver, what we call the IDRD waiver, that is overseen by DDSN for the state. But again, the ultimate authority for how that waiver operates and the programming services provided through that waiver is overseen by Department of Health and Human Services.
That's correct. So another aspect of the home and community-based services waiver that's an important new rule or regulation that the federal government has passed is the home and community-based services final rule. And this is going to implicate services that people get through the Medicaid waiver programs. So first of all, the home and community-based final rule requires that individuals engage in what's called a person-centered planning process. So usually the way this works is that an individual meets with their waiver case manager, and they're going through a process of determining which services they want to access, again, based on whether or not they need that service, but also that the services are designed to help an individual meet their needs and meet their goals. So for example, if an individual wants to live independently, what services are they going to need to be able to live, say, in an apartment or, in a private home or something like that, again, with the goal of trying to keep them out of an institutional placement. So through that process, it's incredibly important that that you as an individual with a disability or a family member that may be participating in this process are strongly advocating for the services that are necessary to ensure that you are able to live as independently as possible, if that's what you would like, or whatever other services you may need. Another aspect of the home and community-based final rule that's important is what's called conflict-free case management. So the federal government dictated that when an individual gets case management services, which again is an important service that is designed to help somebody access the services that Medicaid and the waivers provide, that those entities are separate from the people that are actually providing the service. So again, for example, your case manager should not be employed by the same organization that is providing your nursing services, or that if you're living in a group home is the director of that group home. Those two entities should be separate. So that it enables the case manager to be a little more independent in their analysis of whether or not that service is truly benefiting you, or if there's any concerns that they can advocate on your behalf for. So that's another important aspect of the final rule. One of the most crucial aspects of the final rule as well is the settings requirements. So again, this applies to residential settings that are available through the home and community-based services waiver. So in South Carolina, that may be through either the IDRD waiver or the head and spinal cord injury waiver. So if you're residing in a group home in the community, the federal government has said that there are certain things that group home has to do or may not do in order that that home is truly in the community, right? So it's not just a mini institution that's placed in the middle of a community. It's actually something where you as an individual can go out and be able to engage with your local church or go shopping independently or work a job independently or things like that. So the final rule has very specific requirements as far as those settings to ensure, again, that you can access the community. Next slide, please. So we're moving away from home and community-based services waivers to a broader topic in Medicaid that's an important one for you to be able to understand in order to access services that may be denied. So a Medicaid fair hearing is a process in which you are arguing that a Medicaid agency has either terminated services or refused to find you eligible for services or reduced your services in a way that you don't think is appropriate. So you have a constitutional right as a Medicaid beneficiary to notice and to engage in this process before your benefits are terminated. So generally speaking, if you receive a notice from the Department of Health and Human Services, you have 30 days to request a hearing from that from DHHS to advocate for your right to receive this service. Now, there are certain exceptions to that. If you're talking about a waiver service through DDSN, they may require you to go through what they call a reconsideration process first. But the notice should clearly state what you have to do in order to request an appeal. And if you have any questions about that, if you get a notice in the mail, that's something that we may be able to provide you some information in order for you to know which is the next step that you need to take. Next slide, please.
Before we move on, sorry, Rebecca, how do they know, first of all, what to say in their appeal? What is the notice going to tell them?
Right. So in the notice that you receive, it should provide information about what the agency intends to do. So it should say, for example, if they intend to reduce the number of hours that you're receiving for nursing services or some other type of service, it should say in the notice. And it should also say, in addition to what they're specifically intending to do, why they're doing it, and what grounds they believe they can be doing it. So again, if they believe that, say you have 40 hours of nursing services, for example, right? And they want to reduce it down to 24. It should say in there that they believe for whatever reason that, it's not medically necessary for you to receive all 40 of those hours. It should be specific in what it describes as far as what their reasoning for that is. And then it should say legally why they are allowed to do that. If we could advance to the next slide, please. One more thing about Medicaid fair hearings before I move on. So when you request a fair hearing, the way that you do that, you're going to, in response to that notice, you may write a letter or you may give a call to the agency in order to request a hearing and specifically state why you disagree with the decision and that you are requesting a hearing on that decision. So I wanted to make sure I mentioned that before we moved on to some other important concepts to keep in mind. So again, these apply overall to any service that you were receiving through a Medicaid, the Medicaid state plan or a Medicaid waiver service. First of all, it's important to know that the law says that you are entitled to receive services with reasonable promptness. So that's basically saying that services shall be furnished, paid for, and provided within a reasonable time frame. So if you have a situation where you have requested, for example, that you receive what's called residential habilitation, that's the name of the service that you would be receiving in a group home. And for some reason, you're not able to access that, the agency is not able to find you a provider, or whatever the situation is going on. It's important to know that the law does give you the right to have that service provided to you within a reasonable time frame. And that applies to any state plan or waiver service. Another important concept is freedom of choice. And that is a right that gives you the choice to select a provider of the services that you're receiving, as long as they're qualified and willing to provide those services. You should have the right to be able to choose amongst the providers that do the service. So for example, if you are requesting personal care aid services or something like that, you should be able to have a list of providers that do that service and choose which provider you would like to provide you that service. Next.
I have one other question that I think some people may be asking if you have not gone through this before. We get a notice that they're going to reduce my nursing services. And I know that I have a right to appeal that. I have a right to ask for a fair hearing. What happens to me in the meantime while this fair hearing is being filed and being argued over?
Right. So when you get a notice regarding a termination of a benefit, like Anna Maria is saying, or they're trying to reduce your waiver services, the notice should give you the option to request that services be continued during the process of the fair hearing. And generally speaking, that you have to make that request within 10 days of receiving the notice. So if you are, again, if it's a situation where your services are being reduced and you're concerned about receiving those while you're appealing the denial or the reduction, you have to move fairly quickly in order to be able to have those services continue during that process. And again, that's an area where if you receive a notice like that and you're concerned and you have questions, give us a call, but give us a copy of the notice fairly quickly as well, so that we can review it and be able to assist you and determine if we're able to assist you. Next slide, please. So lastly, we wanted to talk a bit about a program within Medicaid called Early and Periodic Screening, Diagnostic, and Treatment. And of course, that's a very long acronym. And this is a mandatory state benefit that is for children under the age of 21. And the EPSDT program is designed to provide comprehensive and preventative health care for children. So there are several aspects to this program. If we could continue to the next slide. One of the first aspects is the S and the D, the ES and D, I should say, of this program is early screening and diagnosis. And so the EPSDT program ensures that children have access to coverage for routine checkups so that doctors and medical professionals are able to quickly identify health and developmental diagnosis. Because we know now that it is crucial to identify these types of disabilities very early, so that there are certain, for example, if you are an individual with autism, it's incredibly important to be able to identify that and be able to start the process of getting ABA therapy, for example, so that you are able to deal with some of the issues that come with that diagnosis and receive that special therapy. So the reason that I wanted to bring up the screening and diagnosis is that this is the crucial link between getting to the treatment piece of the EPSDT program, which is the aspect of it that is often what we're advocating for, is that once this diagnosis happens, an individual should, or a child under 21 should be able to get treatment. If we could go to the next slide, please. So the treatment piece says that, again, once that disability or diagnosis has been established, the state has to arrange and cover any item of service, regardless of whether it's in the state plan, that is medically necessary to correct or ameliorate the health conditions of children. So this is an incredibly important advocacy tool if you have, if you are a parent of a child with a disability, or if you're a service provider, and there is a problem with a service that you believe is medically necessary for your child, and the child is in the Medicaid program, the state should be covering and arranging for that service. So again, if it's a situation where we keep going back to the nursing services example, but if there's a child that requires a set of nursing hours that's maybe even above what the state would generally cover, because that child is eligible under the EPSDT program, they've been diagnosed with something, the doctor has shown it's medically necessary for them to get those services, the state should be covering even the services above the normal hours that they would be covering. So it's an incredibly important tool in South Carolina, in state, nationwide, but particularly for children that we serve, to point out to DHHS that when a service is identified in this way, it's necessary for them to be covering it for kids. If we can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so just in conclusion, I know Anna Maria and I wanted to, of course, we'll open it up for questions, but we wanted to share some advocacy tips and some thoughts that we have about how this information would be useful to you. So for that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Anna Maria for a moment.
Okay. One of the things we talked about is some of the ways that Medicaid is really an insurance policy for individuals in our state. And again, harking back to the fact that every insurance policy, including Medicaid, has that state plan. It has a list of services that the state has said you may be able to get if you can show medical necessity for that. So first of all, you do have the right to go in, even as an adult, and see your doctor, get an evaluation, and get them to write up what therapies, drugs, or other courses of treatment you need based upon your individual circumstances and your individual conditions. And then that write-up is what's used to help you request services. And that's where knowing what is in a state plan, knowing that there is a state plan and how you find it is important. The state plan is online. You can access it. You can also contact HHS and get information about the state plan. And importantly, you can go to your case manager or your service coordinator and talk with them about what the state plan looks like and what questions you have under what is going on with you and your circumstances, what is available to me. Or let's say that I'm getting older and it's harder for me to get around. So what do I need to think about in terms of going to the doctor, getting testing and evaluations about mobility and the strengths and weaknesses that I may have? And do I need that wheelchair, or do I just need a cane? And is it something that I might be able to get through the Medicaid program? And again, do I have other payers that might come in first and take care of those treatments and services? So always, the more education that you have about what is in your plan, what plan you're on, and asking questions, not only of your case manager or service coordinator, but your doctors and what they're putting down in writing. Medicaid is one of the programs that is going to require a lot of things to be in writing and to be submitted to the right office. So asking questions, do I need a prior authorization to get a new wheelchair? Do I need a prior authorization submitted to get approved for a new course of treatment, and why? And how do I write that up? And how do I ensure that the doctor's write-up is sufficient to ensure that I get this treatment or service or device as soon as possible, so I don't have to fight over it? Again, looking at EPSDT for children, the question really isn't who pays for the services or treatment for children. It's what does the child need, and who are the providers that are best able to meet the needs of that child. So it shouldn't matter whether the child is on a waiver, whether they are going through a managed care organization, their fee for service. Again, it doesn't matter who pays for it. The first question for children is, what conditions do they have? What are the recommendations on trying to provide care and treatment therapies for that child as soon as possible to give them the best chance for improvement or to live the most independent life that they can live in the future? And where are we going to get those services for the child, even if it's calling for something that's out of state? One of the things that Rebecca and I were talking about shortly before this session began is thinking about the important transitions in your life and in the lives of your family members. It's easy when you think about educational milestones. Is your child going to go into a preschool program? Are they going into kindergarten? And then are they going to elementary school, to middle school and high school, college? And each step along those paths those are milestones, educational milestones. So there are different questions that you have and different areas that you look for help to determine what you need to plan. Do I need to get them a backpack? What needs to be in that backpack? Things like that. So you're constantly questioning as your child ages what you need to know, adjustments that need to be made for your child, and where do you go to get those questions answered and to get services so that your child transitions through the educational process. That same approach can be taken and should be taken when you're looking at your medical care, when you're looking at your insurance care. So questioning your service provider, learning what's in the state plan, learning about programs for children. If you or your child are under the age of 21, everybody should know about early periodic screening, diagnosis, and treatment, and how you access evaluations and screening for those individuals under the age of 21. And secondarily, the other thing is, where do you go when you have a problem? Your first question should be taken to your service coordinator, to your case manager, because they are the individuals besides your family and besides you who know you best. And they also know the system. So do you have a good service coordinator? Do you know what your options are in terms of where you go if you are dissatisfied with your service coordinator? You have the right to choose a service coordinator. That's a basic right under Medicaid. So then if the service coordinator is working with you, but it's still not working out, that's where that appeal or fair hearing comes into play. And when do you know you need it? Anytime that you believe you are being denied a service that you have requested, anytime that you believe that your services are being reduced or changed or terminated, then you may have the right to a fair hearing or an appeal of that issue. And then your question comes in, where do I go to file that appeal? And how is that appeal filed? And when does it need to be filed? So again, knowing what your resources are. Do you need to talk to the service coordinator? Are you satisfied with the responses they gave you? Do you need to reach out to disability rights? Do you need to reach out to an independent living center like ABLE South Carolina or another organization with questions? Do you need to go to the helpline or online to Department of Health and Human Services or DDSN and get answers that way? Those are some of the important things that you need to ask, and keeping a record of what you have done and what your questions are and the answers that you received and who you received them from is equally important. In the Medicaid situation, again, everything is document driven. So you should receive a written notice of denial of service or reduction of service. If you do not receive a written notice, ask for a written notice. If you ask for a written notice, I would follow up either with an email or an actual letter that is sent in to my service coordinator or to the agency or both that says, I understand something is happening with my services or my application, and I need a written notice of what is happening and when it's going to happen so I know what to do. And keep a copy of everything that you send out, every communication that's made to your service coordinator and the agency. Rebecca, do you have some other suggestions?
So the other thing I was going to mention is Anna Maria was talking about transition and thinking about, what happens when a child turns 21 in particular, because in the Medicaid program, like we talked about, specifically with EPSDT, that ends when somebody turns 21. So something that is very important to keep in mind is that if you believe that you or your family member or an individual that you're assisting is eligible for a home and community-based services waiver, that you apply early. Because right now in South Carolina, a lot of waivers have very, very long waiting lists. So it's important for you to be able to get on that waiting, get a finding of eligibility, get on that waiting list and get on it as quickly as possible so that when it's time for you to be able to, when it's time that you transition beyond 21, you're on that waiver and you're able to get the services so that there's not that gap when you sort of when you turn 21 and you're sort of falling off the cliffs colloquially, with the children's services versus, when you become an adult. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're thinking about transitioning beyond 21. So I think at this time, we are open for questions.
All right, so if you have a question today, you can type it into the chat box or you can use the raise your hand button. And as we wait for more of them to come in, I can go ahead and read off the first one for you guys. From the Upstate, it says there seems to be such a shortage of nursing services for pediatrics. Many families are unable to get nursing due to this. Do you all have any suggestions?
I think part of our problem throughout the whole system is that there's staff shortages in almost every line of work, particularly in any provision of medical care services, personal aids. There seems to be a shortage both in community services and in facilities. So that's a struggle. That's not an excuse, but that's the reality of what's going on right now in South Carolina and frankly across the nation. I would say that one of the things that you need to do is make sure that you have talked with your service coordinator and you also have reported to the agency that your child is entitled to nursing services. You have done certain things to work with your service coordinator to try to get providers in, and the services are still not being provided. And what you may have to do at some point in time is contact us or contact HHS or both and determine whether or not the lack of provider is actually violating the rights of your child or you to those services. Again, realistically, there's a shortage of workers, but also one of the things that we are all supposed to do is to try to again, get services. So we might need to think outside the box. In some settings, I've heard that providers are actually entering into contracts with companies outside of South Carolina, and they bring down employees on a short-term basis that have already been approved and already have the appropriate training and education and probably licensing to do certain services. So is that something that can be done? Can the nursing provider that you want to use in the upstate do a contract to get temporary nurses from another agencies or something like along that lines? But one of the things that you need to do is remember to file complaints when you don't have services and when you don't get questions answered.
And we do have a comment that says that they were told that when they were looking that it had a lot to do with pay for the private nurses as well.
Yeah, you know, there's always an interesting dynamic between Medicaid and other sources of payments. Usually Medicaid is in every state is going to pay less for an hourly service or any service than private insurance and other entities that are paying. But, you know, that shouldn't really be your problem. Your problem is you are entitled to that service. It's been approved by Medicaid, so we need to make it happen. It doesn't solve it for you, but again, it doesn't, at that point in time, how much the person is paid or who's paying them shouldn't matter. So we need to know if there are a group of individuals, particularly kids who are not getting nursing services, if there are not enough providers or what's going on, then what is the state doing to address that issue?
So we've continued to have comments from one person, and they've asked, or they've said that this is interesting about bringing in temps and have a question. So we encourage the families to file the complaint. Is that the next step? If they've waited for months and they can't get a nurse?
Yeah, I would say, you know, you need to make sure if you talk to your service coordinator, has the service coordinator effectively raised that? And a lot of times they have. The service coordinator is the first person that's going and knocking on the agency door saying, I've got a number of clients who are not getting nursing services because there's just no nurses in this area. But is there something that you can do that will also file that complaint? So talk to your service coordinator, find who they're talking to. And I would put it in writing at a certain point in time. I would take the time to outline all the efforts that you and hopefully the service coordinator have done to try to get those services in place and what's happened, and then send it off to, again, if it's a situation where your child is getting services, let's say from DRSC, but it's also a Medicaid service, you can send it to both agencies, but I would at least send it to one of them. And let them know that you want a response. You know, you want to have a meeting, you want to have this problem solved. And so obviously you need a response within a certain period of time. And I would give them, you know, if you're mailing it or emailing it, give them time to receive it. But I would want to at least have a discussion about what's going to be done about it within a few weeks or 2 weeks. It all depends upon, you know, what is going on with your situation. The more crucial the need for services, the faster you want to push. And you can file a fair hearing, or you can go through a grievance process with DRSC, or if you're getting services through a managed care organization, you go through that process first, a grievance process through the MCO first, and then go up to Medicaid. But you can always copy Medicaid on everything that you file so they know it's out there. And you can talk to your service coordinator about where your service is coming from. Are they coming from the state plan? Are you a fee for service person, or are you a managed care person? And do you need to file that first? And again, you should be able to get some of this information in writing, including the time periods for those appeals. And it's really, really important that you be prepared to meet every deadline. So don't delay. You can always dismiss an appeal if you filed it and it gets solved. But if you miss your deadline and you don't file your appeal, you sometimes have to reapply and start the process over again to get a new appeal period. And so you're just delaying it. the service coordinators, the hearing officers, the people in the appeals process, all understand that these are crucial services that are needed by the clients, by your family members or you, and they're going to want to address it as soon as possible. Has anybody, and maybe you can put this in the chat, anybody in here listening to this presentation, has anybody filed an appeal in the past? And if so, was it a fair hearing? Did you actually have a hearing, or did you resolve it beforehand? I know that's kind of an informal poll, but if we could get some information about that, I think that would be great. Because we have some time and we can actually talk about what fair hearings are like. Okay, I don't see anything coming up in the chat so far. So a fair hearing or an appeal in the Medicaid system. Okay, here's one. This person filed an appeal for their son's TEFRA. Okay. So then they actually also had to reach out to a congressman. TEFRA is one of those special programs for children who might not otherwise be eligible for Medicaid, but it is an important piece, an important area where people, or children in particular, can get services that they need in spite of maybe being over the income limits. But again, because it's a Medicaid program, there's a right to a fair hearing or an appeal. So the first thing is to always file your appeal within the deadline and do it in writing. You can launch an appeal with a telephone communication or an email, but you want to have the basis of the appeal, what you're appealing and why you're appealing, in writing as soon as possible. And you want to get it in by the deadline or even earlier, because again, if you get it resolved, you can dismiss it and let the hearing officer know that the agency has met your needs and they'll dismiss it. But if you miss the appeal period, then you have to start over quite often, and that can delay services. So you start out with the written request for an appeal, and you state in there, I needed 20 hours of nursing services and the agency only gave me 10, or I have been receiving 40 hours of nursing services for the past 10 years from Medicaid, and I suddenly got a notice that they're reducing me down to 20, and I don't know why, or they're telling me it's because of this, and I don't agree. And then you send them copies of the information that you believe shows the medical necessity for your service and any notifications that you have received from the agencies about the reduction or changes to your services or the denial of service, and what they used to base their decision on. So that's why asking for a written notification of changes or denials of service is so important, because the agency is required by Medicaid law to tell you why you're being denied. The policy, the procedure, the law that says, I'm making this change for you, or I'm denying this service, they have to tell you what the policy is, why they're doing it, and when it's effective, so that you know. It's usually that you have to get the notification 10 days before the date that a service is going to be eliminated or changed. So in that scenario where you're already receiving 20 hours of nursing services and they're going to reduce you down to 10, they can't do it by Friday. They can't notify you on Thursday and say tomorrow is the day that you're suddenly down to 10 hours going forward. They have to actually give you 10 days written notice before the change or reduction occurs. So sometimes there is a problem with the notice procedure. You can complain about the lack of good notice as part of your fair hearing or appeal request. And even if you think it was a minor thing, if you believe that they didn't give you proper notice, whether it's the time was too short, they didn't write down the reasons, they didn't tell you everything you needed to know, it's still an important thing to note in your complaint or your appeal request that there was a problem with the notice, and then provide whatever notice that you received so that the hearing officer can get that. Then what's going to happen is the hearing officer is going to want to get information. They're going to make sure they have everything they need from you about your situation, what services you needed, what the change was, and why you're fighting it. And they're also going to ask the agency to come in and basically explain what they did, why they want to do it, and the basis for their action. Now, another important thing to know in an appeal process is you are entitled to get the file from the agency who's made the decision. And that means everything that they looked at to make a determination about the change in services or the denial of services, you have the right to get a copy of that so that you can effectively argue against the agency and their decision. So it's important to, if you don't already have that information, to request that. And I would again do it in writing, either via email or with the letter that you send it into the agency, and you can copy the hearing officer on that. And they will make sure that you get a copy of everything that is going to be used in the appeal. If you do not resolve the situation by an agreement beforehand, what's going to happen eventually is the hearing officer can ask for telephone conferences between the two parties to see if you can work this out without going forward with the appeal. But if the appeal goes forward, if you cannot agree, then they're going to have a hearing. And the hearing is going to usually be in Columbia. You can request that hearings be held closer to your home, like in the Greenville area or the Charleston area, but you need to do that as early as possible. That's a special request. And you need to put that in writing so the hearing officer can have an opportunity to address that. Sometimes that is justified because you or the individual beneficiary have transportation problems, or it's a provider issue. You may be the sole caregiver for your family member, and you literally cannot put them into the car and take them to Columbia because you're the caregiver. So you want everybody to come to you, but make that request in writing as soon as possible and be prepared to explain in that request why you want to have the hearing in your hometown as opposed to Columbia. When you go into the hearing officer is going to explain the rules. The basic thing is that both sides are going to be able to talk about what's going on and to present evidence to show why that side is right and why you should get services or the services should stay the same, or the agency is justifying the change that it's going to make. And any documentation that is going to be presented as evidence usually would have been shared with both sides before you go in. And you definitely want to have extra copies when you go in that day. The hearing officer is going to ask the agency usually to state their position and then let you respond to it. You can ask questions from the agency people who were there. It's all going to be recorded. And then you have a right to appeal if you lose at that fair hearing. Usually, if you're at the fair hearing stage, it's a separate division of Health and Human Services, by the way, in case you didn't know that. But they are charged with making objective reviews and decisions based upon what the fight is about. But you can, if you lose that fair hearing, you can appeal that to the administrative law court, and your rights to that appeal will be explained in the written decision that you get from the hearing officer. Do we have more questions at this point? Okay, I know we've covered a lot of different topics, and we've talked a lot about things that are not in the outline, but some of the fundamentals of Medicaid law that you should always remember is Medicaid is an insurance policy. So find out what is in your policy. Where do you go to get that information? How can you get that information? And trying to understand some of the basic concepts of Medicaid, like the fact that you have a right to appeal, you have a right to written notice, you have a right to have your applications for services or your applications or requests for a new service or a change in service addressed within a reasonable period of time. And you have a right to appeal all of these things. In legal terms, you have the right to what we call due process. And that's why appeals are in the Medicaid agency referred to as fair hearings. An important thing that we didn't talk about, but I do want to make note of, is that you can represent yourself in a Medicaid appeal, or you can ask somebody else to argue the case on your behalf. It does not have to be an attorney. As many of you know, as the family member who filed a TEFRA appeal on behalf of their son knows, sometimes the person themselves or the family member is the best advocate for that person. So you can go in, you can file that fair hearing, you can argue it yourself, you can make the presentation of the documents and evidence and ask the questions of the other side. And you will sometimes do a better job than any attorney in the world, because again, you know the ins and outs of what you need or what the person needs. However, if you do want to have an attorney, you can take an attorney in as well. So, don't be afraid to ask for help, whether it's us or your service coordinator or an agency employee. We are here to provide free information on referral. We can also sometimes give you some technical advice. And if we can, and if we think it is something that we can work on, we will offer representation if it's appropriate.
Thank you, Anna Maria. What a great summary. And thank you, Anna Maria and Rebecca, for your presentation today. I have not seen any other questions come in today. So we appreciate everyone for coming. Just a reminder that the presentation will be on YouTube by probably the end of the month. If you want to go back and revisit it or share it with anyone, and stay tuned for our upcoming sessions. You can always go to our website to find those dates and links. And we appreciate everyone coming, and we will see you again next time, hopefully. Thank you.